Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on connecting through culture, how to reach and inspire Hispanic donors. My name is Elise Haynes from True Sense Marketing, and I will be here to help with all of your technical issues, which hopefully there are none, throughout today's webinar. But we're really glad you're joining us for this 30-minute session as part of our Spring Quick Byte webinar series. Today, David Torres, my colleague at True Sense Marketing, and I are joined by our partners at Stinghouse Creative, Alberto and Christy. We are working together with their agency to find new ways to acquire and cultivate Hispanic donors. So we're really excited that you're a part of today's conversation. Alberto and Christy, thanks so much for joining us and spending your time. So without further ado, let us know in the chat what words come to mind when you think of Hispanic marketing. This is both an AV check to make sure our audio is coming through loud and clear, and also just to get your preconceptions before hearing the content of what words come to your mind when you think of that. So I see Roberto's typing, some of you are typing. So Alberto, what do you typically see when you've done this presentation in the past? Some of those key themes.
I think one of the key themes is language. I think that's the first place that people go to as they're trying to figure out Spanish seems like the intuitive answer, but I think that by the end of this conversation you'll have a bit more nuanced and layered response to how to best wrap our arms around the opportunity of language and how to use it effectively.
Great. And Alberto, I'll let you just take it from here.
All right, outstanding. Well, listen, Elise and David and our friends at True Sense, thank you so much for this opportunity to come before you and have a conversation that professionally I've been having the better part of 26 years. Chrissy just a little bit less because she's a little bit younger, but she's been at this for a long, long time as well. And just really an honor to be here, not only with her, but David and some of the projects we're working together on with True Sense. It's really great to have people who are in the arena, practitioners, having this conversation and sharing our insights for all those within the sound of our voice to advance their business objectives, specifically against this U.S. Hispanic consumer. And so our aim today is threefold. One is to get to know the who are these Hispanics? Who are we talking about? The U.S. Hispanic consumer history and its context, which is ever changing literally by the day. But we do have a historical arc on it that we want to share. I would also note that this conversation is one that when we've shared in the past can easily go into an hour or two. And so we're going to be moving swiftly, not because we're short of content, but rather we have so much content. And I hope that there's a desire to learn even more on the other side of the time that we have here together today. The second thing is to explain the what, the marketing considerations that drive success or get in the way of success. Both those insights are equally as important to understand as we approach this U.S. Hispanic marketplace. And the third is to understand the why, specifically to increase the philanthropic potential for your nonprofit clients that you handle, and trying to find the path to find the insights that really unlock the opportunity between this audience and the clients that you serve. And so these are lofty goals to tackle in about half an hour, but we're going to give it our best shot, and off we go. And with that, I'm gonna invite my colleague Christy to join us here in a moment. Before I do, I have a question, and your responses are going to show up in the poll button there next to chat. There should be an icon that says polls on it. And the question is, how ready do you feel to kick off a Hispanic focused fundraising effort in your region today? No wrong answers, just, candor is the currency. And so just really trying to get a baseline as to how ready you feel to kick off a Hispanic focused fundraising effort in your region today. And totally ready, Yvonne. All right. I like the confidence there. I dig it. And so, hopefully you'll feel even that much more ready on the other side of today's chat. And with that, I'm going to Let me see. Let me look at what the polls look like. God, let me get into the polls there for a little. Not all. Okay. All right. We'll be monitoring that. So I encourage you to submit your votes there to this poll question. And we may circle back to it a little bit later, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pass the mic over to my colleague, Krista Vidal, to lead us forward.
Thank you. So it seems like, I see 42% responded a little, and some creeping up there and getting closer. Hopefully by the time we check back in at the end of this chat, we'll have gotten you even closer to that so ready goal of ours. And so want to kick things off with just zooming out in terms of what we'll cover today, starting with what we say. We're going to talk a little bit about vocabulary and the terms Hispanic versus Latino, Latina, Latinx, how we say it, talking about the distinctions between assimilation and acculturation, the difference between translation and transcreation. Then we're going to talk about where we say it. So what are some channel considerations and context that we need to be cognizant of when we consider the practical application of some of the things that we're going to talk about here today. And then last but not least, the reason that we're all here, really get into the meat of why it matters in terms of how to convert that into philanthropic potential. And so with that, we're going to jump right in and talk about the distinction between the word Hispanic and Latino. And we're going to watch a video here in just a second, but some things that I want us to know before we dive into that is a little trivia for you that the term Hispanic and Latino tend to be used interchangeably. When you're reading articles, you hear it on the news and things like that. But actually the term Hispanic was invented by the US Census. So that is a term that was born and lives exclusively within the context of the United States. I mention that because if you think about someone from South American country, the Caribbean, Spain, etc., and you use that word, that may not be something that's germane to them, that they're familiar with, because it was created as a very specific response category within the US Census, as opposed to Latino is much more broadly used when you think about Spanish-speaking constituents outside of the United States, but we're going to get into those particulars here in a second. So the good news is there's not going to be a pop quiz at the end of this, but you will have access to this. So just understanding that distinction, if you want to impress your friends, now you know the difference between the word Hispanic and Latino. Don't assume that anywhere that you see it out in broad public culture that means that they are using it correctly. You at this point probably know better than them because it's not so commonly referenced, but there are some intentional reasons for when to use which, and that's something to consider when we think about communications more broadly. And so as we keep going, the difference between assimilation and acculturation. So assimilation tends to refer to when a person or group more fully adopts the customs, values, and behaviors of another typically dominant culture. So think about someone that has immigrated to the United States and now has more made a decisive decision to adopt American culture, versus the term acculturation, which is when a person or group adopts some aspects of another culture, but really is intentional about retaining the elements of their original country of origin. So an example of what that could look like: immigrate from another country, but you still speak your native language at home, prioritize cultural events, activities, references, but perhaps you still engage in some more American culture events. For example, you might not celebrate Thanksgiving in the country that you came from, but you celebrate Thanksgiving now that you're in the United States. So that would be an example of acculturation, and really speaks to the adaptability of where you fall within that spectrum. Everyone has sort of their own journey and can make their own decision on where they fall on that spectrum. But as marketers, when we think about communications, knowing how far or not we are from any one of these two sort of pillars can determine how deeply we want to lean into some specific culturally relevant insights or not. And so on with the vocabulary lesson, the difference between translation and transcreation. So not sure how common it is if any of you have heard that word, but the sweet spot is right there in the middle, this intersection between the idea of language, culture, and emotion. And so what do we mean by the word translation versus transcreation? Translation, and we're going to dive a little deeper into these definitions, more typically speaks to converting text from one language to the other. Tends to be a bit more literal and straightforward. And again, most commonly referenced when you think about making sure that we're accurately converting language, as opposed to transcreation allows for a little bit more room to account for cultural relevancy. And think about the idea of, if you've ever heard an idiom or a catchphrase in English, if you tried to directly translate that into another language, Spanish, Chinese, it doesn't matter. That sentiment may not make sense, and you actually have to use different words to get the idea across, which is different than just converting it from one language to the next. So we're going to run through an example here to dive in a little deeper. So for example, if you went to Google Translator and typed in doing the most good, which should sound like a familiar phrase for any of you that work on the Salvation Army business, doing the most good. And we ask Google to translate that into Spanish. Some of the results that we get are haciendo la mejor, haciendo lo mejor. So that's just the direct translation from English A to Spanish B. Now, let's test that and put it back into Google Translator from Spanish back to English. So when we ask Google, what does haciendo lo mejor mean in English? It replies, doing the best. A little different? Yay or nay? You guys tell us. Go to the poll and vote on, does doing the most good and doing the best mean the same thing? Okay. So some varied response. Majority say no way. Some say close enough. Okay. Well, I would argue that if you're a brand manager in the room, you want it to be exactly right. And so that's one of the learnings that we want to talk about when we think about translation versus transcreation. And so understanding that difference. Translation, again, converts content into another language. In this context, we're talking about Spanish. The objective is really to preserve consistency. It's limited to text and emphasis, and there's an emphasis on technical language skill, right? Grammar, accuracy, etc. As opposed to transcreation combines translation with the creation of new content. It's not just a direct literal conversion. It has the objective to preserve the emotion and intent. So more so than the accuracy of the words, we want to make sure that the meaning that we're going for is preserved. It accounts for all content elements, whether it's text, design, visuals, and lastly has an emphasis on a cultural understanding and creativity. So again, when we think about the difference between the two, the reason that it's important to have this lens when we're looking at any and all creative or marketing communications is converting from English to Spanish doesn't mean that our job is done and that we are guaranteed to communicate effectively. We want to make sure that at every step of the way, we're being culturally relevant, because for our messaging and our marketing to work, we need to make sure that we're connecting in a meaningful way. And part of that is creating space for this cultural nuance, of which language is just one part of. As transcreation tells us, the visuals are important, the design is important, and the entire package can really be a nod to acknowledging the culture of this community in a meaningful way. And so,
hey, Christy, can I interrupt you before you go any further? Can we go back to the last slide that you were talking about? So I love this conversation, and I just wanted to add the following set of thoughts. Number one, we're in the business of communications, more specifically the persuasive arts, right? That's why we're here. And so even that Google Translate exercise, the lens is not even, is it technically right? Right? The question is it emotionally persuasive? Right. And I think about the work that we've been doing with David and his team. And while we're massaging every single word and every single sentence, and when we hit on the right combination of words, there's a strong emotional reaction. And we're like, that's it. That's the way abuela speaks. That's the way my grandma says it. That's the, and that's when you've landed on it. So I just wanted to sort of like perhaps state the obvious, but just really underscore that it's just not an intellectual exercise of like it's right, it's wrong, technically or not. It is, have we connected with the people? And that's the juice that we're looking for. So David, I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
No, you're right, Alberto, because at the heart of any fundraising offer, it's the emotion, right? What emotion? And for the Hispanic audience, that emotion is everything. And you build trust through emotion. So these nuances, right, and these brainstorms that we've been having, like, oh, that's it. I remember hearing that, or you feel it.
You feel it.
You feel it, and then you build trust with that donor, that prospective donor. So
right. So anyway, just wanted to underscore that. Thank you so much, Christy. I didn't mean to interrupt. You can go on.
No, not at all. That's why we're here.
That's why we're here.
So I'm going to draw your attention to the poll section one more time. True or false? A Hispanic targeted message should always be encased in Spanish language creative. Is that a true or false statement? If we're speaking to a Hispanic target, we must always be speaking Spanish. What do you guys think? Okay. No one fell for the trick question. So let's unpack what we mean by that. Spoiler: Hispanic marketing does not have to equal Spanish language creative. It absolutely can, and in several instances does. But what we want to be cognizant of is that always they are not necessarily synonymous, and it doesn't have to at every turn be all or nothing. So in 2019, the Pew Research Center reported that 72% of Latinos ages 5 and older spoke English proficiently. So we can deduce that the Hispanic consumers aren't necessarily needing to be targeted with ads in Spanish to be impacted. And so I'll just give you this consideration. So I was born in the United States. I am of Cuban parents. Both of my parents were not born in this country. I speak fluent Spanish, but I enjoy and consume almost all of my media in English. I enjoy Spanish music, and I prefer to consume most of my content in English. So that's a great example of, I would technically fall under the category of a Hispanic consumer, but I wouldn't need to exclusively be spoken to in Spanish to be connected to. Now, it's a vast target with a diverse set of constituents against it. And I'm going to go back to something we talked about earlier in terms of that spectrum, in terms of assimilation versus acculturation. Where any given audience member that we're connecting to falls on that spectrum is going to inform how deeply do we want to lean into language. Some data and some research is going to have to be done to make sure that we're being intentional about how English or Spanish dominant is this particular audience, and not make too many assumptions about, if we're speaking to a Hispanic consumer, that must exclusively mean we need to speak to them in Spanish. There is some room for interpretation there. Alberto, did you want to say something before I moved on? No.
Yeah, I was just going to add, and it's sort of like revisiting that emotional chord. That's really how we define if we won, right? How did you know that you won? Is it because the words happen to be technically right? We already had that conversation. Now, no, not necessarily. All cultures across the language spectrum have words and winks that says "you get me," right? Oh, you must be. Wait a minute. Is that a Pittsburgh accent that I hear? Wait, where are you from? Right? The way you said that word, there was something in the intonation of how you communicated that thing or the word choice that you selected that signals to someone else that's from that group, that tribe, that community, we must be one and the same. And that's what we're after when we're connecting your brand. And the philanthropic chord is ensuring that we're assembling the words in a manner that provoke that response. This brand gets me. Go ahead, David. I don't know if you want to say something there.
Yeah, and in addition to that's transferred across generations, right? Like Christy had said, I'm more comfortable engaging in this way, but also localization where they reside has a huge impact on how they want to be approached, right? To acculturation and assimilation, there's pockets and areas there's more comfort levels on either end of that spectrum. So all these things take into account when addressing the audience. So.
Nuance.
Nuance, right.
And so continuing on this path, we know that Hispanic consumers are likely to utilize both languages. That's kind of what we've been working towards here, using a combination of Spanish and English, commonly known as Spanglish, or a form of code switching. It's estimated around 40 million people in the US speak Spanish. What do we mean by code switching and this idea of Spanglish? And that means that inside the same conversation, sometimes inside the same sentence, we can be speaking two languages at a time. And to Alberto's point earlier, in terms of every language and every culture has its own nuances and sort of cultural winks, there might be something that you're trying to say in English, for example, that doesn't quite have the right words or meaning that it does in Spanish. And so mid-sentence, you might just switch real time if you're speaking with someone that's going to understand that, and immediately, no translation needed because you both understand what you were trying to get at. And so it's kind of an abstract idea if you haven't witnessed it or done it yourself. So we're actually going to watch a quick example of a commercial from a brand that invested in Hispanic communications and specifically talked about this. So this is a great example of this commercial aired across a series of channels. Most of it was in English. The call to action at the end was in English. But if you picked up on certain instances where they integrated Spanish language, particularly in the context that would be so familiar to a Hispanic culture in terms of a multi-generational home, right? So there was mom, dad, grandma, kids, etc., all sort of under one roof. Everybody, coalescing around this idea of celebrating her first paycheck, and sort of each interaction paid off a different cultural nuance. Some of it was tied to language, but some of it were these other signals just in terms of who was in the frame. That is a great example of how to integrate and account for this idea of code switching in a way that acknowledges Hispanic culture, but also speaks to where on the spectrum this particular audience might fall in terms of they don't need to be spoken to exclusively in Spanish to understand the message. And so as we get closer and close here to the end, some highlights that we wanted to call out again in terms of the practical application of some of the insights that we talked about here. When we think about the different channels, print, for example, Spanish is just a wordier language than English is. So having to plan for additional real estate just from a design perspective is something to consider. When you think about radio, there are over 10 Spanish dialects. So prioritizing geographical relevancy and the idea of localization that David spoke to is important. The difference between Mexican Spanish versus Caribbean Spanish versus South American Spanish is very clear to those that understand it. And so making sure that when you're thinking about casting that voiceover or featuring that particular language, are you using the dialect most relevant for the area and the audience where it's going to air? I think about video, the visual cues that speak to culture. We want to make sure that we're showing and telling, not just telling. Again, going back to that Wells Fargo example, nobody talked about the multi-generational home. It was just part of the story. It was a natural integration and example of that. And then lastly, when we think about digital, understanding that first exposure sets expectations. And so making sure that we have a consistent experience in terms of what any given user can expect to see as they move through the donor or consumer journey is something we want to be cognizant of. So I'll draw your attention again to the poll section. Does your database speak Spanish? What do we mean by that? When you think about the idea of language, there is a Spanish language alphabet that has unique characters and winks to the language. And so that accounts for proper names as well. One of the things that we wanted to introduce this idea of is if we're going to be intentional about targeting U.S. Hispanics, and again, where do they fall in that acculturation scale? Think about yourself, and when you receive a piece of mail, is your name spelled correctly? That's an important wink to, do they get you? Do they know who you are? Having a database that can account for these different accents and characters, while not a mandatory, is a really nice to have when we think about wanting to communicate to this audience effectively. So what about Hispanics and giving? The reason that we're all here tying all this together. So this was a recent article that was published by the AP, and pull-out quote that we wanted to emphasize here is, because the personal is so important to Latinos, because we define family generally more broadly than some non-Latinos, informal giving is part of our culture. You can count the amount of studies in philanthropy on Latinos on one hand for the last 40 years. The data we need is, how do we get the $50,000 a year family to give to the local community nonprofit? So what does this mean? If you saw that headline, it says Latino charitable giving rates drop sharply, but that's not the full story. The missing part of that component that this quote is speaking to is, it's not that they're not giving, is that they are giving in ways that we're not measuring. This idea of informal giving. They're giving to their community, they're giving to their church, they're giving to their nephews, they're giving to their family. And so it's not a matter of capacity, it's a matter of funneling and formalizing that gift. And so when we think about how do we action that for our purposes, wanting to make sure that we're asking ourselves, what is the relatable impact that our specific organizations are having on the Hispanic community is the question that we need to be asking. Because it's, again, not a matter of capacity. It's a matter of asking in the right way and really formalizing what are those opportunities to give to organizations that have the kind of scalable impact that they're looking for. This idea of emphasizing specific shared values, localized messaging, telling culturally relevant stories of impact, speaking in language in context when that makes sense. And ultimately, this idea that it's not just about charity, it's about throwing the rope back over the fence. And so with just a minute or two left, I want to turn it over back to Elise or anyone else that wants to jump in if there's any questions.
Yeah, just put in the chat if you have a question for Christy, Alberto, or David, let us know. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Oh, and we want to know, are there any new words that come to your mind when you think of Hispanic programs? So while you're thinking of a question, if anything new has popped into your mind, let us know as well. Well, and while you're doing all that good thinking, I'd like to draw your attention to, we have some more Quick Byte webinars coming up in a couple of weeks, over the next couple of weeks. So if you would like to join us for another one of these 30-minute sessions, that's how you can join us for that. So let's see if any questions have come from the chat. I don't, Yvonne is typing. While she's typing, any closing thoughts, David, Alberto, Christy, for the group?
No, ultimately, building trust with this audience, right? It's all about trust. We get creation, the emotion, the language, the culture. That's really our goal as fundraisers, to build trust with that donor so they give.
Yeah, and I would say, David, thank you, and Chris and everybody at TrueSense and everybody that took the time to be part of this conversation today. Something did come up here in the chat about the databases and the alphabet and the accent, and how sometimes it gets mangled when you move from one platform to another. My response to that is, this is the moment to do the work to work through those things. Right. I've been having this conversation for 26 years. 26 years ago, the appetite to tackle these things was less because the opportunity wasn't as clear and as urgent as it is today. The fact that you're seeing brands like Wells Fargo earlier and Major League Baseball, and there's a whole bunch of folks that are really getting into this space. So they're finally doing the work to make those things smoother. Seize on this moment, advance the cause. The time is now.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you'll join us for another Quick Byte this spring. Thank you, Alberto and Christy, for coming alongside us in this partnership, and we look forward to seeing you all soon.
Thank you. Bye.